The base commander's patronizing smile faltered when the radio crackled to life. "This is Valkyrie-Seven, requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing." His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. That call sign, that voice, the young woman he'd dismissed as sweetheart just hours earlier, was now commanding the most critical operation of the year. But how she got that call sign and what happened next would change everything they thought they knew about who deserved to fly. This is the story of Irene Hill, the pilot they underestimated until the moment she proved them all catastrophically wrong. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight line at Riverside Air Station, painting the concrete in shades of gold and amber. Irene Hill stood at the edge of the tarmac, her flight suit crisp and properly pressed, watching the senior pilots conduct their pre-flight briefings. At 23, she was the youngest pilot at the station, and everyone made sure she never forgot it. She'd arrived at Riverside 6 months ago with top marks from flight school, recommendation letters that praised her technical precision and natural instinct for flying. But none of that seemed to matter here. The moment she'd walked through the doors of the operations center, she'd been reduced to something less than a pilot. She was sweetheart, dear, the girl. Anything but her name or rank. Lieutenant Commander David Walsh ran the base with the confidence of someone who'd never been questioned. He was 48, with silver threading through his dark hair and a jawline that photographs well for military recruitment posters. He'd flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts and had the commendations to prove it. He also had very specific ideas about who belonged in a cockpit. "Morning, sweetheart," Walsh had called out when Irene entered the briefing room that first week. "Coffee station's in the corner if you want to make yourself useful." Irene had stood there, her flight bag slung over her shoulder, her pilot's wings gleaming on her chest. "Actually, sir, I'm here for the mission briefing." Walsh had looked at her as if she'd suggested flying to the moon. "The briefing is for active pilots, dear. I'm sure someone can find you something appropriate to do." That had been 6 months ago. Since then, Irene had been assigned to every peripheral duty the base could invent. She flew cargo runs that barely qualified as flying, shuttling supplies between bases in perfect weather with 0 challenges. She conducted instrument checks on grounded aircraft. She reviewed maintenance logs and updated flight manuals. Everything except what she'd trained for, what she'd excelled at, what she'd sacrificed everything to do. Real flying. The other pilots weren't openly hostile, which somehow made it worse. They simply didn't see her as one of them. When they gathered to discuss tactics or share stories from missions, they didn't invite her. When complex operations were planned, her name never appeared on the roster. She existed in a strange limbo, technically a pilot but functionally invisible. Captain Eric Vandenberg was Walsh's second-in-command, a by-the-book officer who enforced every regulation with rigid precision. He'd pulled Irene aside during her 2nd month at Riverside. "Hill," he'd said, his Norwegian accent clipping the words short, "I'm going to be straight with you. Commander Walsh doesn't think women belong in tactical operations. You can fight it, or you can accept it and make the best of your situation here." Irene had felt something cold settle in her chest. "And what do you think, sir?" Vandenberg had studied her for a long moment. "I think it doesn't matter what I think. This is Walsh's base, and he makes the assignments. My advice, transfer out. Find a posting where you'll have better opportunities." But Irene hadn't transferred, partially because she hated the idea of running away, of letting Walsh's prejudice dictate her career. But mostly because of something she'd discovered during her 3rd week at Riverside, something that made leaving impossible. The base housed a specialized rapid response unit, one that deployed for emergency situations across the entire European theater. They handled everything from medical evacuations in hostile territory to emergency supply drops in disaster zones. It was exactly the kind of flying Irene had dreamed of doing, the kind that required not just technical skill, but instinct, courage, and the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure. The rapid response pilots were the elite of Riverside. They had a ready room, separate from the main operations center, their own briefing schedule, their own culture of excellence, and their own call signs earned through actions that proved their worth. Irene had learned everything she could about the unit without drawing attention to her interest. She studied their flight patterns, memorized their procedures, understood their tactics. At night, in her quarters, she ran through simulations on her personal tablet, flying imaginary missions that tested every skill she possessed. She also discovered something else. The unit was chronically understaffed. Budget cuts and transfer cycles had left them with barely enough pilots to maintain their operational tempo. They needed people, but Walsh refused to consider her for the position. The rapid response unit requires a certain temperament, he'd explained during one of the few times Irene had directly requested consideration. It's high-stress, high-stakes flying. I need pilots who can handle pressure without getting emotional. The implication was clear. Women, in Walsh's worldview, were too emotional for serious work. Never mind that Irene had never shown anything but consummate professionalism. Never mind her test scores or recommendations. She was female, therefore she was emotional, therefore she was unsuitable. That morning, as Irene watched the rapid response team head out for another mission, she made a decision. She'd spent 6 months being patient, being professional, waiting for an opportunity that Walsh would never give her. It was time to create her own opportunity. She turned away from the flight line and headed toward the auxiliary hangar, where the reserve aircraft were stored. She had a plan, one she'd been developing for weeks. It was risky, potentially career-ending, but she was done waiting for permission to prove herself. The auxiliary hangar was quiet, staffed by a skeleton crew of maintenance personnel who paid little attention to junior pilots. Irene had befriended Sergeant Pavel Kowalski, the head mechanic, during her months of cargo duty. He appreciated that she actually understood aircraft systems, that she could discuss engine performance and avionics without needing everything explained. "Pavel," she said, finding him under the wing of a transport helicopter. "I need a favor." He rolled out on his maintenance creeper, wiping grease from his hands. "What kind of favor?" "The kind where you don't ask too many questions." Pavel studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "The small reconnaissance bird in Bay 3. She's technically grounded for a software update, but mechanically she's perfect. Flight systems are fully operational. How long until someone notices she's missing from the maintenance log? If someone were to take her up for a test flight, maybe 6 hours before anyone asks questions." Irene felt her heart rate accelerate. 6 hours. That was more than enough time for what she had planned. And if that test flight happened to include some advanced maneuvers, maybe some low-altitude navigation exercises. Pavel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I would expect any competent pilot to thoroughly test all systems before signing off on the update." "Thank you, Pavel." "I didn't hear anything," he replied, already rolling back under the helicopter. "And Hill, whatever you're planning, make it count." Irene spent the rest of the morning maintaining her normal routine, giving no indication that anything was different. She filed paperwork in the operations office, reviewed cargo manifests, and made herself visible, doing exactly what was expected of her. But her mind was elsewhere, running through the plan, step by step, calculating risks and contingencies. The key was timing. The rapid response unit was scheduled for a training exercise that afternoon, a routine patrol over the coastal sectors. They'd be airborne for approximately 4 hours, running standard formations and communication drills. Walsh would be in the command center, monitoring their progress, which meant he'd be exactly where Irene needed him to be. At 1300 hours, she made her move. She walked calmly to the auxiliary hangar, her flight helmet tucked under her arm as if she had every right to be there. Pavel had left the bay, 3-door unsealed, and the reconnaissance aircraft sat ready, its systems humming with quiet power. The bird was smaller than the tactical fighters the rapid response unit flew, but it was fast and maneuverable, More importantly, it was equipped with the same communication systems, which meant she could monitor all base frequencies and be heard on them, if necessary. Irene completed her pre-flight check with practiced efficiency, control surfaces responsive, fuel levels optimal, avionics packages fully functional. Everything was perfect. She strapped in, feeling the familiar embrace of the pilot's seat, and began her startup sequence. The helicopter lifted smoothly, and Irene felt the tension she'd been carrying for 6 months begin to dissolve. This was where she belonged, in the air with nothing between her and the sky but skill and determination. She kept her altitude low as she departed the base, staying under radar coverage until she was clear of the immediate area. Once she was safely away, Irene banked hard and set a course for the coastal training sector. She'd studied the Rapid Response Unit's exercise plan, knew exactly where they'd be and what they'd be doing. What she was about to attempt was audacious, possibly insane, but it was also the only way to prove what she was capable of. The radio chatter from the training exercise filled her headset. She recognized the voices, had memorized their call signs. Raptor 1 was Major Thomas Brennan, the unit commander. Falcon 3 was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of only 2 women in the unit, and someone who'd never once acknowledged Irene's existence. The others were men she'd watched from a distance, pilots who'd earned their places through demonstrated skill. Irene checked her position. She was approaching the training sector from an unexpected angle, using terrain masking to stay undetected. The Rapid Response Unit was running a standard intercept drill, practicing the kind of coordination required for emergency situations. She waited, watching her instruments, timing her approach perfectly. Then, when the moment was exactly right, she keyed her radio. Unidentified aircraft entering training sector 7 from bearing 270. Please identify. The response was immediate, sharp with surprise. This is Raptor 1. Training sector 7 is restricted. Identify yourself immediately. Irene smiled. This was it. The moment that would either validate everything she'd worked for or end her career in spectacular failure. Raptor 1. This is Reconnaissance Bird from Riverside Auxiliary, requesting permission to join your exercise. There was a pause, then Major Brennan's voice returned, hard with authority. Negative, Reconnaissance Bird. This is a closed exercise for qualified rapid response personnel. Return to base immediately. With respect, Raptor 1, I'm qualified. I'm requesting an opportunity to demonstrate that qualification. Another pause, longer this time. Irene could imagine the confusion in the rapid response aircraft, could picture Brennan trying to figure out who was crazy enough to interrupt their training. Then a different voice came over the radio, one that made Irene's stomach clench. This is Riverside Command. Commander Walsh's voice was cold with barely controlled anger. Unidentified aircraft, you are ordered to return to base immediately. This is not a request. Irene took a deep breath. This was the point of no return. Riverside Command, respectfully requesting permission to complete one intercept drill before returning to base. I believe I can demonstrate capabilities relevant to rapid response operations. Who is this? Walsh demanded. Identify yourself immediately. This was it, the moment when everything changed. Irene's voice was steady, calm, almost serene as she replied. This is Lieutenant Irene Hill, sir. Call sign pending approval. The radio exploded with overlapping transmissions. Walsh was ordering her to land immediately. Brennan was demanding to know what was happening. Other voices were chiming in, creating a chaos of confused communication. Irene cut through the noise with precision. Riverside Command, I have visual on Raptor 1, requesting permission to execute a simulated intercept approach. If I can successfully complete the maneuver to Major Brennan's satisfaction, I'm asking for consideration for rapid response training. Hill, you are way out of line. Walsh's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Land that aircraft now, or I will have you arrested the moment you touch down. Understood, sir, Irene replied. But I'm already here, and the training sector is active. One intercept run. 5 minutes. If I fail, I'll accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate. If I succeed, I'm asking for a fair evaluation. The radio went silent. Irene could imagine Walsh in the command center, his face red with fury, calculating his options. He could order her arrested, could end her career, could make an example of her that would discourage any other pilot from stepping out of line. But he couldn't deny that she'd put him in an impossible position. If he forced her down without giving her a chance, he'd look petty. If he let her try and she failed, it would validate every dismissive thing he'd ever said about her capabilities. And if she succeeded, Major Brennan's voice came over the radio, measured and professional. Riverside Command, I'm willing to observe this intercept attempt. If Lieutenant Hill can demonstrate proficiency, it would be valuable information for future assignment decisions. Another pause. Irene held her breath. Then Walsh's voice returned, tight with controlled anger. You have one attempt, Hill. Make it count, because if you fail, you're finished at this base. Irene's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision. The reconnaissance bird responded, like an extension of her own body, banking smoothly as she positioned herself for the intercept approach. Below, the coastal terrain rolled past in shades of green and blue, the afternoon sun glinting off the water. Raptor 1, I'm beginning my approach vector, she transmitted, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Major Brennan's response was clipped, professional. Copy that. I'll maintain current heading and altitude. Let's see what you've got, Hill. Irene had studied intercept procedures until she could execute them in her sleep. The theory was straightforward. Approach the target aircraft from an optimal angle, match their speed and trajectory, and establish position without creating any safety risks. In practice, it required split-second timing, perfect spatial awareness, and the kind of instinct that couldn't be taught in a classroom. She dropped her altitude, using the terrain to mask her approach. The reconnaissance bird might be smaller than the tactical fighters, but it was nimble. She could use that advantage. Her instruments showed Raptor 1's position clearly, and she calculated the intercept angle with the kind of precision that had earned her top marks in flight school. The approach was textbook. Perfect. Irene brought her aircraft up behind Brennan's position, matching his altitude and speed with smooth precision. She could see his aircraft clearly now, could imagine his surprise at how quickly she'd established the intercept position. Raptor 1, I have you at my 12 o'clock. Range 200 meters, matching your speed at 300 knots. Brennan's voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there before. Good positioning, Hill. Now let's see if you can maintain it through evasive maneuvers. Without warning, Raptor 1 banked hard left, dropping altitude and accelerating. It was a standard evasion tactic designed to break an intercept lock. Most pilots would struggle to maintain position through such an aggressive maneuver. Irene didn't hesitate. She'd anticipated this exact move, had practiced the counter-maneuver 100 times in her mental simulations. She rolled with Brennan's turn, compensating for the altitude drop with perfect timing, and came out of the maneuver, still locked in position. Still with you, Raptor 1. In the command center, Walsh watched the radar displays with mounting disbelief. Hill was matching Brennan, move for move, maintaining position through maneuvers that would challenge experienced pilots. His hand gripped the edge of the console, knuckles white with tension. Vandenberg stood beside him, his expression unreadable. She's good, he said quietly. Walsh didn't respond. He couldn't. Everything he'd believed about Hill's capabilities was being systematically dismantled in real time. Brennan tried another evasion, this one more aggressive. He pulled into a steep climb, then rolled, inverted, and dove, a complex maneuver designed to disorient pursuing aircraft. Irene stayed with him, her movements fluid and confident, her aircraft responding to the slightest touch of the controls. The other rapid response pilots were silent now, watching the display with professional interest. This wasn't just competent flying. This was exceptional flying, the kind that marked a pilot as truly skilled. "All right, Hill," Brennan transmitted, leveling out his aircraft. "I'm impressed. Let's try something more interesting. Can you execute a tactical approach in a simulated emergency scenario?" Irene felt her pulse quicken. This was beyond the standard intercept drill, moving into the kind of advanced maneuvering that rapid response pilots needed to master. "Ready when you are, Raptor 1. Brennan outlined the scenario quickly. He would simulate an aircraft in distress, unable to maintain altitude. Irene's job was to approach, match his erratic flight pattern, and establish a stable escort position that would allow for communication and guidance. It was exactly the kind of challenge Irene had been preparing for. She acknowledged the parameters and waited for Brennan to begin his simulated emergency. When he did, cutting his power and entering a controlled descent with irregular banking, Irene responded with the kind of instinct that separated good pilots from exceptional ones. She didn't just match his movements. She anticipated them, positioning herself to provide maximum assistance while maintaining safe separation. "Excellent form, Hill," Brennan said, and this time there was genuine admiration in his voice. "You've got the touch." The exercise continued for another 10 minutes, Brennan throwing increasingly complex scenarios at Irene, each one designed to test different aspects of her skill. She handled them all with the same calm precision, her responses showing not just technical proficiency, but genuine tactical thinking. Finally, Brennan called an end to the evaluation. "All right, Hill, I've seen enough. Return to base, and we'll debrief." Irene felt a mixture of relief and triumph as she acknowledged the order and began her return flight. She'd done it. She'd proven her capability in the most dramatic way possible. Whatever consequences she faced for her unauthorized flight, no one could deny that she had the skills. The landing at Riverside was smooth, controlled. Irene taxied the reconnaissance bird back to the auxiliary hangar where Pavel waited, his expression carefully neutral. She completed her shutdown procedures with methodical precision, then climbed out to face whatever came next. Commander Walsh was waiting on the tarmac, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Beside him stood Vandenberg and Major Brennan, who'd returned from the training exercise. Behind them, a small crowd of base personnel had gathered, word having spread about what happened. Irene walked toward them, removing her helmet, her posture straight and military correct. She was prepared for anything: arrest, court-martial, immediate dismissal from service. What she wasn't prepared for was the expression on Brennan's face, a mixture of respect and something that might have been amusement. Walsh spoke first, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Lieutenant Hill, you are confined to quarters pending formal disciplinary proceedings. You took an aircraft without authorization, interfered with a training exercise, and showed blatant disregard for direct orders." "Yes, sir," Irene replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I accept full responsibility for my actions." "However," Brennan interjected, stepping forward, "before any disciplinary action is taken, I think we need to discuss what I observed during that exercise." Walsh turned to him, irritation clear in his expression. "Major, with respect, her flying ability isn't the issue here. The issue is discipline and following proper procedures." "Isn't it, though?" Brennan's voice was mild, but carried an edge of challenge. "We've been understaffed for 6 months, Commander. You've rejected every transfer candidate as insufficiently qualified. Meanwhile, you've had one of the most naturally gifted pilots I've ever seen running cargo missions." The gathered crowd murmured, and Walsh's face reddened. "That's not a fair characterization of—" "I watched her execute maneuvers that most of my veteran pilots would struggle with," Brennan continued, his voice growing firmer. "She maintained perfect position through aggressive evasions, demonstrated exceptional tactical awareness, and showed the kind of instinct that can't be taught, and she did it all in an aircraft she's probably never flown before, with no preparation or briefing." Vandenberg cleared his throat. "The Major raises valid points, Commander. Perhaps we should consider—" "I don't need advice on how to run my base. Walsh snapped, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. He looked at Irene, and she could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. Lieutenant Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd, still in her flight suit. She stopped beside Brennan, her expression serious. "Permission to speak, sir?" Walsh nodded curtly. "I've been with the Rapid Response Unit for 2 years," Chen said. "I've flown with the best pilots in the service. What Lieutenant Hill demonstrated today was exceptional by any standard. If we're serious about maintaining operational readiness, we need to seriously evaluate her for the unit." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, more supportive. Irene stood silently, watching Walsh struggle with a situation he'd never anticipated. He'd built his authority on certain assumptions, and those assumptions were crumbling in front of the entire base. Walsh was trapped, and everyone watching knew it. If he pursued severe disciplinary action against Irene now, after her demonstration of skill, he'd look petty and vindictive. But if he backed down, he'd be admitting that his months of dismissing her capabilities had been wrong. "Commander," Irene said quietly, breaking the tense silence, "I know I violated protocols. I'm prepared to accept appropriate consequences, but I'm asking for one thing: a fair evaluation for the Rapid Response Unit, conducted by Major Brennan, according to standard qualification procedures." It was brilliant, and Walsh knew it. She was offering him a way out, a chance to save face, by treating this as a formal evaluation, rather than an act of insubordination. If she failed the official qualification, his position would be vindicated. If she passed, he could claim he'd always intended to evaluate her properly. Brennan seized on the opportunity. "That's reasonable, Commander. We have standard qualification protocols. Let Lieutenant Hill go through them officially. If she meets our standards, we gain a qualified pilot. If she doesn't, then appropriate action can be taken regarding today's incident." Walsh looked between them, calculating his options. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "Fine. Major Brennan, you'll conduct a full qualification evaluation. If Lieutenant Hill passes every component to your satisfaction, we'll consider her for the unit. If she fails any portion, she faces disciplinary action for today's unauthorized flight." "Understood, sir," Irene said, relief flooding through her despite the high stakes. The crowd dispersed slowly, personnel returning to their duties with plenty to discuss. Irene noticed several pilots nodding to her with newfound respect as they passed. Even Chen offered a slight smile before heading back to the Rapid Response Ready Room. Vandenberg lingered after Walsh departed. "That was either very brave or very stupid, Hill, possibly both." "Yes, sir. The qualification evaluation won't be easy. Brennan's a fair evaluator, but he maintains high standards. You'll be tested on everything: technical skills, tactical thinking, emergency procedures, teamwork capabilities." "I'm ready, sir." Vandenberg studied her for a moment. "I believe you are. But understand this. You've made yourself visible now. Everyone will be watching to see if you can back up today's performance. The pressure will be intense. I've been dealing with pressure for 6 months, sir. At least now it's the right kind of pressure." A hint of a smile crossed Vandenberg's normally stern face. "Fair point. Good luck, Hill." As he walked away, Irene allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. She'd gambled everything on one unauthorized flight, and somehow, impossibly, it had worked. She wasn't out of danger yet. The qualification evaluation would be rigorous, and failure would mean the end of her career. But she'd proven the most important thing: that she belonged in the air, that her skills were real, and that the only thing holding her back had been assumptions that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities. Pavel approached from the hangar, wiping his hands on a rag. "That was quite a show, Lieutenant. The whole base is talking about it. I hope I didn't get you in trouble." "Me? I just maintain the aircraft. What pilots do with them isn't my concern." His expression turned serious. "But, for what it's worth, you did good up there. Real good. Thanks, Pavel. When's the qualification evaluation?" "I don't know yet. Soon, I imagine." The qualification evaluation began 3 days later, during which Irene had barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from preparation. She reviewed every procedure, studied every scenario, ran through countless simulations in her mind. This was her chance, possibly her only chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. Major Brennan conducted the evaluation with meticulous professionalism. The first day focused on technical skills, precision flying, navigation under various conditions, aircraft systems knowledge. Irene performed flawlessly, her months of self-directed study paying off in ways that clearly impressed the evaluation team. The second day brought tactical scenarios. Brennan and Chen flew alongside her, creating complex situations that required quick thinking and coordinated responses. Emergency extractions, hostile environment navigation, multi-aircraft coordination. Each scenario was designed to push her limits, to see how she performed under pressure. Irene excelled. More than that, she demonstrated the kind of intuitive tactical sense that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. She didn't just follow procedures, she understood the principles behind them and could adapt when situations deviated from the textbook. On the third day, Brennan introduced the final component, teamwork evaluation. Rapid response operations required pilots to work seamlessly together, to trust each other completely in life or death situations. He paired Irene with different unit members for various exercises, watching how she communicated, how she integrated into their established rhythms. Chen was her partner for the most challenging scenario, a simulated medical evacuation from hostile territory with multiple complications. They had to coordinate their approach, cover each other's positions, and execute a precision extraction under simulated enemy fire. Irene found herself matching Chen's movements instinctively, their aircraft moving together like partners in a complex dance. Chen called out threats, and Irene responded perfectly, their communication crisp and efficient. When complications arose, they adapted together, neither hesitating or second-guessing. After they landed, Chen approached Irene with an expression of genuine respect. "You're good, Hill. Really good. I'm sorry I didn't see it before." "You didn't have reason to," Irene replied. "I was never given the opportunity to show it." "That changes now. If Brennan passes you, and I think he will, you'll be one of us, and we take care of our own." The evaluation concluded that evening with a formal debrief. Brennan sat across from Irene in the ready room, her performance records spread across the table between them. Vandenberg and Walsh were both present, along with Chen and two other senior rapid response pilots. Brennan spoke with careful precision. "Lieutenant Hill, I've conducted dozens of qualification evaluations during my career. I hold every candidate to the same rigorous standards, regardless of background or circumstances." He paused, looking directly at her. "You've not only met those standards, you've exceeded them in several key areas." Irene felt her heart racing, but kept her expression neutral. "Your technical flying skills are exceptional. Your tactical thinking is sophisticated and adaptive. Most importantly, you've demonstrated the kind of temperament we need in rapid response operations, calm under pressure, decisive when necessary, and capable of functioning effectively as part of a team." He looked at Walsh, then back to Irene. "It's my recommendation that you be accepted into the Rapid Response Unit, effective immediately." The silence in the ready room stretched for several heartbeats. Walsh sat rigid in his chair, his jaw working as he processed Brennan's recommendation. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting for his response. He'd backed himself into a corner with his agreement to abide by Brennan's evaluation, and now the moment of truth had arrived. "Commander," Brennan prompted gently, his tone respectful but firm. Walsh cleared his throat, his fingers drumming once against the table before falling still. "Major Brennan's evaluations have always been thorough and fair. I see no reason to question his judgment in this case." The words came out stiff, formal, but they came. "Lieutenant Hill, you're assigned to the Rapid Response Unit effective immediately. Report to Major Brennan for integration training." Irene felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for so long. She'd forgotten it was there. "Thank you, sir." Walsh stood abruptly, gathering his papers. Major, ensure she understands the expectations and standards required of rapid response personnel. He paused at the door, looking back at Irene, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Don't make me regret this decision, Lieutenant. After he left, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Chen grinned and extended her hand. Welcome to the unit, Hill. Hope you're ready to work harder than you ever have in your life. Irene shook her hand, firmly. I've been ready for 6 months. The other pilots introduced themselves properly for the first time. Lieutenant James O'Brien, a Scotsman with 15 years of experience and a dry sense of humor. Captain Andreas Vogel, German precision personified, who flew, like his aircraft, was part of his body. They treated her not as the base novelty or the girl who'd caused a scene, but as a fellow pilot who'd earned her place. Brennan dismissed the others and gestured for Irene to remain. That was the easy part, he said, once they were alone. The real work starts now. You've proven you can fly. Now you need to prove you can do it consistently under real-world conditions when lives depend on your performance. I understand, sir. Do you? Brennan's gaze was penetrating. You took a huge risk with that unauthorized flight. It worked out, but it could have ended your career. Now you're in the unit and the scrutiny doesn't stop. Every mission, every decision, every action will be watched and evaluated. Some people will want to see you fail to prove that Walsh was right about you. Let them watch, Irene said quietly. I didn't come this far to fail now. Brennan nodded, satisfied. Good. Your integration training starts tomorrow at 0500. We'll run you through our standard operating procedures, communication protocols, and team coordination drills. You'll fly with different partners until we determine where you fit best in our rotation. Over the following weeks, Irene immersed herself in rapid response operations. The work was demanding, exactly as challenging as she'd hoped. Early mornings and late nights, constant training, endless scenarios designed to prepare them for every possible emergency. She flew in all weather conditions, practiced techniques she'd only read about, and learned from pilots whose experience dwarfed her own. The other unit members accepted her gradually, their initial skepticism giving way to respect as she proved herself mission after mission. O'Brien took her under his wing, sharing hard-won wisdom about reading weather patterns and judging risks. Vogel taught her advanced maneuvering techniques that pushed her skills to new levels. Chen became not just a colleague, but a friend, someone who understood the unique challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated field. But Irene still hadn't flown a real mission. All her training, all her qualifications remained theoretical until she faced an actual emergency. And as the weeks passed, she began to wonder when that opportunity would come and whether she'd truly be ready when it did. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, 6 weeks after Irene's acceptance into the Rapid Response Unit. She was in the ready room, reviewing flight logs when the emergency alarm pierced the air, its urgent wail sending adrenaline coursing through every pilot's veins. Brennan burst through the door, already pulling on his flight suit. We've got a situation. Commercial ferry in distress, 60 nautical miles northwest. Engine failure, taking on water, 200 passengers on board. Coast Guard is responding, but they're 20 minutes out. We're closer. The room exploded into controlled chaos. Pilots grabbed gear, checked equipment, moved with practiced efficiency born from countless drills. Irene's hands were already reaching for her helmet when Brennan's voice cut through the noise. Hill, you're with me. O'Brien and Vogel, you're back up. Chen, coordinate with Coast Guard and get us real-time weather updates. Irene's heart hammered as she followed Brennan toward the flight line. This was it. This, her first real mission, lives depending on their response. Everything she'd trained for crystallized into this moment. You ready for this? Brennan asked as they conducted rapid pre-flight checks. Yes, sir. Good. Because I need you focused and sharp. That ferry has families on board, including children. The water's cold this time of year. Every minute counts. They were airborne within 4 minutes of the alarm, their helicopters cutting through the afternoon sky. With urgent purpose, Irene forced herself to breathe steadily, to channel her nervous energy into heightened awareness. She monitored instruments, tracked their position, listened to the stream of updates from Chen and Coast Guard coordinators. The ferry came into view 15 minutes later, and Irene felt her stomach clench. The vessel was listing badly to starboard, waves breaking over its deck. Passengers crowded the rails, some already in life jackets. The scene was chaos, panic written in every desperate movement. "Riverside Command, this is Raptor 1, Brennan transmitted. "We have eyes on the ferry. Situation is critical. Vessel is taking on water rapidly, listing approximately 30 degrees. Passengers are preparing to abandon ship." "Copy that. Raptor 1. Coast Guard ETA is 15 minutes. Can you provide assistance?" Brennan looked at Irene, a question in his eyes. This was beyond standard procedure. They weren't equipped for large-scale water rescue, but they could make a difference, could save lives in those critical minutes before the Coast Guard arrived. "Where we can stabilize the situation," Irene said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Deploy life rafts, guide evacuation, provide eyes for Coast Guard approach." Brennan nodded sharply. "Riverside Command, we're engaging. Valkyrie-Seven will coordinate passenger evacuation while I assess damage and guide Coast Guard approach." Valkyrie-Seven. Irene felt the words register, felt their weight. Brennan was giving her the call sign, trusting her with critical responsibility on her first real mission. There was no time to acknowledge the significance. Lives were at stake. "Valkyrie-Seven, copy," she transmitted, taking control of her aircraft with smooth precision. "Beginning evacuation coordination." She brought her helicopter into position above the ferry's deck, low enough to be clearly visible, but high enough to avoid the vessel's masts and rigging. Through her cockpit window, she could see terrified faces looking up, passengers who'd been enjoying a routine ferry ride, now fighting for survival. Irene keyed her external speakers. "Attention passengers of the ferry, this is military rescue coordination. Remain calm. Coast Guard vessels are en route. Deploy all available life rafts on the port side away from the list. Move in orderly groups, children and elderly first. We will guide your evacuation." Her voice, projected from the helicopter, cut through the panic. She saw movement on deck, saw passengers organizing, crew members responding to clear direction. Brennan was circling the ferry, assessing damage, coordinating with the captain via radio. "Valkyrie-Seven, the captain reports they can maintain buoyancy for approximately 10 minutes, Brennan transmitted. "After that, she's going down. We need faster evacuation." Irene's mind raced, calculating options with the tactical precision she'd developed through countless training scenarios. 10 minutes to evacuate 200 people. The Coast Guard was still 12 minutes out. They needed to buy time, needed to accelerate the evacuation process. "Raptor 1, requesting permission to descend and deploy our rescue harnesses. We can start lifting passengers directly, prioritize those unable to use life rafts." There was a pause. What she was proposing went beyond their usual operational parameters. It would put her aircraft dangerously close to a sinking vessel, in unstable conditions, with limited margin for error. But it would save lives. "Approved," Brennan responded. "Prioritize children and injured. O'Brien, Vogel, you're 2 minutes out. Prepare to assist with direct evacuation." Irene brought her helicopter lower, her hands steady on the controls, despite the wind gusts created by the ferry's superstructure. The vessel was rolling with increasing severity, its deck becoming a chaotic landscape of sliding debris and desperate passengers. Her crew chief, Sergeant Luis Torres, prepared the rescue harness. He'd been silent during the flight, but now his voice came through calm and professional. "Ready when you are, Lieutenant. I'll coordinate passenger loading." "Copy that. Let's do this." The first passenger they lifted was a child, no more than 6 years old, crying for her mother. Torres secured her in the harness with gentle efficiency, while Irene held the helicopter rock steady despite the challenging conditions. The lift took 45 seconds, every one of them an eternity. As Irene compensated for wind, monitored the ferry's movement, and kept her aircraft in perfect position. When the child was safely aboard, her mother came next, then an elderly man with a walking cane who couldn't have managed a life raft. Each lift required absolute precision, total focus. Irene found herself entering a state of heightened awareness where everything else fell away except the immediate demands of the mission. O'Brien and Vogel arrived and immediately joined the evacuation effort, their aircraft taking up positions around the ferry. The operation became a carefully choreographed dance of 3 helicopters, Coast Guard coordinators, ferry crew, and desperate passengers, all working toward the single goal of getting everyone off safely. "Valkyrie-Seven, you're doing great," Chen's voice came through from base. "Coast Guard is 7 minutes out. Keep it steady." The ferry lurched suddenly, its list increasing dramatically. Irene pulled up instinctively, avoiding a collision with the vessel's mast by mere meters. On deck, passengers screamed, some losing their footing on the increasingly tilted surface. "All aircraft, ferry stability is compromised," Brennan transmitted urgently. "Accelerate evacuation. This vessel is going down faster than projected." Irene didn't waste time acknowledging. She repositioned immediately, bringing her aircraft back into position for another lift. Torres worked with incredible speed, loading passengers as fast as safety allowed. Each helicopter could carry multiple evacuees, but the weight limited their capacity and maneuverability. The Coast Guard vessels appeared on the horizon, their powerful engines driving them toward the crisis, but Irene could see they wouldn't arrive in time. The ferry was listing past 45 degrees now, its deck nearly vertical. Passengers who hadn't yet evacuated clung to railings, their situations becoming desperate. "Raptor 1, I'm seeing passengers in the water on the port side," Vogel transmitted. "They jumped or fell. They're struggling in the cold water." Brennan made an instant decision. "Vogel, O'Brien, focus on water rescue. Valkyrie-7, you'll lead on ferry evacuation. Get the remaining passengers off that deck." Irene acknowledged and repositioned her aircraft above the steeply tilted deck. The ferry was dying, sinking slowly but inexorably. Less than 30 passengers remained on board, most of them clinging to whatever they could reach on the nearly vertical surface. Part 10. The ferry's final moments were a blur of desperate action. Irene held her helicopter in position with muscles screaming from the constant micro-adjustments required to maintain stability. The wind had picked up, gusts buffeting her aircraft as she worked to extract the remaining passengers from the tilting deck. Torres was a machine, securing passengers in the rescue harness with swift efficiency. A teenage boy, terrified but trying to be brave. A woman clutching a cat carrier, refusing to abandon her pet. 2 crew members who'd stayed to help others and now found themselves among the last to evacuate. "Valkyrie-7, Coast Guard is on scene," Chen transmitted. "They're deploying rescue boats for water recovery." "Copy that. I have 6 more passengers on the ferry deck. Estimate 3 more minutes for complete evacuation." The ferry groaned, a deep, metallic sound that signaled its structural integrity was failing. Water poured through ruptures in its hull, and the list was approaching 60 degrees. The deck was no longer a surface that could be walked on, but a wall that passengers clung to desperately. Irene brought her helicopter even lower, closer than was safe, giving Torres the best possible angle to reach the stranded passengers. She could see their faces clearly now, see their fear and hope intermingled. These were people who'd woken up that morning expecting an ordinary ferry ride, never imagining they'd be fighting for their lives. The 4th-to-last passenger was an elderly woman who'd frozen with fear, unable to move despite the crew's encouragement. Torres talked her through the process with calm patience, his voice steady and reassuring. Irene held position, fighting wind and turbulence, her entire focus narrowed to the single task of keeping her aircraft exactly where it needed to be. 3 passengers left, then 2. The ferry was sinking faster now, its bow completely submerged, water rushing across the deck. Irene's fuel gauge was entering the caution range, but she pushed that concern aside. They weren't leaving, until every person was off that vessel. The last passenger was a crew member, a young man who'd helped coordinate the evacuation. He waved Irene off, gesturing toward the water, indicating he'd swim to the Coast Guard boats. But Irene could see his exhaustion, could calculate that he might not make it in the cold water. "Negative," she transmitted through the external speakers. "You're coming up, that's an order." He hesitated, then nodded and reached for the rescue harness Torres lowered. 30 seconds later, he was aboard, and Irene pulled her helicopter up and away as the ferry began its final descent beneath the waves. The vessel slipped under the surface with surprising speed, leaving only debris and life rafts floating where it had been. But the water was full of Coast Guard boats, full of survivors being pulled to safety, full of people who would see their families again because of the coordinated rescue effort. "All aircraft, this is Raptor 1, Brennan transmitted. "Ferry is down. All passengers accounted for. Excellent work, everyone. Return to base." Irene set course for Riverside, her hands finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline started to fade. Torres touched her shoulder, his voice warm with approval. "Outstanding flying, Lieutenant. You saved a lot of lives today." "We saved them," Irene replied, "all of us together." The flight back seemed to take both forever and no time at all. Irene's mind replayed the mission, analyzing decisions, noting things she'd do differently next time. But underneath the analytical thinking was a profound sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. As they approached Riverside, Chen's voice came through. "Valkyrie-Seven, be advised the entire base has been monitoring your mission. Prepare for a reception committee." Irene smiled, despite her exhaustion. "Copy that, Riverside. Valkyrie-Seven coming home." The landing pad at Riverside was crowded with personnel, far more than would normally gather for a returning mission. As Irene brought her helicopter down with practiced precision, she could see faces she recognized and many she didn't, all watching as Valkyrie-Seven touched down. The rotors were still spinning down when Brennan's helicopter landed beside hers. Through her cockpit window, she saw him give her a thumbs up, a gesture of respect that meant more than any words could have conveyed. This was validation not just of her skills, but of her judgment, her courage, her right to be here. Torres helped the last passengers disembark, ensuring they were met by medical personnel for evaluation. The elderly woman Irene had lifted from the tilting deck grasped her hand as she climbed out of the aircraft. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Thank you for not leaving us." Irene squeezed her hand gently. "That's what we're here for. I'm glad you're safe." As she walked across the tarmac toward the operations building, the assembled personnel began to applaud. It started with the Rapid Response Unit members, then spread through the crowd until the sound echoed across the entire base. Irene felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion, overwhelmed by the recognition after so many months of being invisible. Commander Walsh stood at the entrance to the operations building, Vandenberg beside him. As Irene approached, Walsh's expression was complex, a mixture of emotions she couldn't fully pass. He extended his hand formally. "Well done, Lieutenant Hill. Your performance today was exemplary." Irene shook his hand, meeting his eyes steadily. "Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve." There was a moment of understanding between them, unspoken but profound. Walsh would never apologize for the months of dismissal, would never admit he'd been wrong about her capabilities. But this handshake, this public acknowledgement, was as close to concession as he could offer. And perhaps it was enough. The debriefing took 2 hours, every detail of the mission analyzed and documented. Brennan led the session with his characteristic thoroughness, but his praise for Irene's performance was unequivocal. She'd made sound, tactical decisions under pressure, demonstrated exceptional flying skills in challenging conditions, and shown the kind of judgment that defined the best rapid response pilots. "The call sign Valkyrie-Seven wasn't provisional," Brennan said as the debriefing concluded. "You earned it today. In Norse mythology, the Valkyries chose who would live and who would die in battle. Today, you chose life for 200 people. The name fits. Chen led the applause that followed, and Irene felt the final barrier dissolve. She wasn't the outsider anymore, wasn't the woman who had to prove herself. She was Valkyrie-Seven, a rapid response pilot who'd earned her place through skill and courage. That evening, the Rapid Response Unit gathered in their ready room for what O'Brien called a proper welcome. It was tradition, apparently, to celebrate a pilot's first successful mission. Stories were shared, experiences compared, and Irene found herself laughing with colleagues who'd become friends. "You know what the best part was?" Chen said, raising her glass. Watching Walsh's face when he realized he'd been wrong about you for 6 months. That alone was worth the price of admission." Vogel, usually reserved, smiled. "I think we all learned something today, about assumptions, about potential, about what really matters in a pilot." "Here's what I learned," O'Brien said, his Scottish brogue thick with good humor. "Never underestimate someone just because they don't fit your expectations, especially when that someone is crazy enough to steal an aircraft to prove a point." The laughter that followed was warm, inclusive. Irene looked around at the faces of her unit, at the people who'd gone from skeptics to supporters, and felt a profound sense of belonging. Later, alone in her quarters, Irene sat on her bunk and allowed herself to process everything that had happened. From that morning, 6 months ago, when Walsh had called her sweetheart and dismissed her capabilities, to today, when she'd led a mission that saved 200 lives. The journey had been difficult, frustrating, often demoralizing, but it had also forged her into the pilot she'd become. Part 12. Final. 3 months passed, and Valkyrie-Seven became a familiar call sign across the European theater. Irene flew mission after mission, each one adding to her experience and reputation. She'd participated in mountain rescues, medical evacuations, emergency supply drops in disaster zones, and coordinated operations with military units across multiple countries. The ferry rescue had been covered by media outlets, and while Irene had declined most interview requests, the story had spread. She received letters from some of the passengers she'd saved, messages that she kept in a folder and read when the demands of the job felt overwhelming. Reminders of why the work mattered, why all the struggle had been worth it. Commander Walsh never became warm toward her, but he treated her with professional respect. More importantly, he'd begun reassigning other pilots based on capability rather than assumptions, and the base's operational effectiveness had improved measurably. Change, Irene realized, didn't always come with apologies or admissions of fault. Sometimes it simply came through demonstrated results. On a sunny morning, much like the one when she'd first stood watching the senior pilots brief their missions, Irene found herself leading that briefing. She stood at the front of the ready room, surrounded by her unit, outlining the plan for a complex multi-aircraft training exercise. The scenario involves coordinated evacuation from a hostile zone, she explained, pointing to the tactical display. Valkyrie-Seven and Raptor-1 will provide air cover while Falcon 3 executes the extraction. O'Brien and Vogel, you're our backup, ready to engage if complications arise. As she spoke, she noticed a young pilot standing at the back of the room, newly assigned to the base, Lieutenant Emma Shaw, fresh from flight school with excellent marks and obvious talent. She looked uncertain, out of place, exactly as Irene had felt 6 months ago. After the briefing, Irene approached her. "Shaw, right? I read your transfer file. Impressive scores." Shaw's surprise was evident. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm hoping to eventually qualify for the Rapid Response Unit." "Eventually?" Irene smiled. "How about we start your evaluation next week? If you've got the skills, there's no reason to wait." Shaw's eyes widened. "Really? I thought there was a waiting period, that new pilots had to prove themselves first through other assignments." "There used to be that thinking," Irene replied, "but we've learned that artificial barriers don't serve anyone. If you can do the work, you should be given the chance to prove it. Talk to Major Brennan. Tell him I recommended you for preliminary evaluation." As Shaw walked away with renewed purpose, Chen appeared at Irene's side, creating opportunities for others now. Look at you, paying it forward. Someone has to, Irene said. No one should have to steal an aircraft just to get noticed. Chen laughed. A fair point, though I have to say, and that unauthorized flight is already legendary. Recruits talk about it in flight school, apparently. The pilot who broke all the rules to prove she belonged. That's not quite how I'd frame the lesson, Irene said, though she was smiling. But I suppose there are worse legacies. The emergency alarm sounded, cutting their conversation short. Both pilots moved immediately toward their aircraft, the response automatic after months of training and real missions. As Irene ran across the tarmac, pulling on her helmet, she keyed her radio. "Riverside Command, this is Valkyrie-Seven. What's the situation?" "Valkyrie-Seven, we have a medical emergency at a remote research station. Patient with severe trauma needs immediate evacuation to hospital. Weather conditions are marginal. Terrain is challenging. You're our best option." Irene felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the sharp focus that came with high-stakes missions. "Copy that, Riverside. Valkyrie-Seven is launching. Send me the coordinates." As her helicopter lifted into the sky, Irene looked down at Riverside Air Station, spread out below. Somewhere down there, Commander Walsh was probably watching from the command center. The base that had once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle was now her home, her launching point for missions that mattered. The radio crackled with updates. Chen coordinating logistics, Brennan confirming backup if needed, Torres preparing medical equipment. They were a team now, functioning with the kind of seamless coordination that only came from mutual respect and shared purpose. "Valkyrie-Seven, you have clearance for direct approach," the controller transmitted. "Be advised, weather window is narrow, estimated 30 minutes before conditions become unsafe." "Understood," Irene replied, banking her aircraft toward the mission coordinates. 30 minutes is all we need." As she flew toward another crisis, another opportunity to make a difference, Irene thought about the journey that had brought her here. From being dismissed as sweetheart to earning the call sign that made commanders freeze with respect, from counting cargo manifests to leading rescue missions, from being invisible to being indispensable. The research station appeared ahead, a small cluster of buildings against rugged terrain. Irene assessed the landing zone, calculated her approach angle, prepared for the delicate work of saving a life in challenging conditions. This was what she'd fought for, what she'd risked everything to achieve. Not recognition or validation, though those had come, but the simple right to do the work she was meant to do, to use her skills where they mattered most. "Valkyrie-Seven, beginning final approach," she transmitted, her voice steady and professional. "Patient evacuation in 3 minutes." Below, she could see people watching, hoping, depending on her expertise to bring their colleague home safely. Just another mission, just another day, but also proof that sometimes the person everyone underestimates becomes exactly the person everyone needs. The helicopter descended, and Irene smiled. She'd proven them all wrong, and she'd keep proving them wrong with every mission, every life saved, every impossible situation resolved. Ethan, because that's what Valkyrie-Seven did. That's who she was, and she was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.